I call it the dinosaur syndrome. Big hearts, small brains. In Washington, it is argued that you are more compassionate if you give away more of someone else's money. I would argue that true compassion is in giving your own money away. So it's one thing to give away other people's money. It's another thing to give away money that you don't even possess. We as a country have a $20 trillion debt. We borrow $1 million every minute. And yet we are putting forward a bill to allocate $15 billion to those who are suffering under Harvey without finding the money anywhere, with just simply adding it to our tab, adding it to our $20 trillion bill. How did we get to $20 trillion in debt? Big hearts, small brains. Nobody has the courage to say, why don't we pay for it? If it's a priority to help those in Texas, and I have great sympathy for those in Texas. My family is there. I have family members with 2 feet of water in their house. So I have great sympathy for those who are in need. But there's no reason to be foolish. We shouldn't just borrow the money. Why don't we take the money from something less important? My amendment, America First Amendment, would take the money from money that we were going to send to foreign countries. We send billions and billions of dollars to countries who hate us. We send billions and billions of dollars to countries who burn our flag. I think it's a very simple choice that when we're looking at helping those in need in our country, we quit sending money to other countries. What my amendment would do would be pay for the $15 billion in aid by taking it out of the foreign aid account. Who gets the money in the foreign aid account? What is it spent on? We spent, I think it's over $100 billion building roads in Afghanistan, blowing up roads in Afghanistan, building schools, blowing up schools, and then rebuilding all of them. Sometimes we blow them up, sometimes someone else blows them up, but then we always go back and rebuild them. Well, what about rebuilding our country? Why don't we look at our country and rebuild our infrastructure, rebuild our roads? For those who are flooded in Texas, let's help them. Let's help them by not sending the money to Pakistan and to other countries that don't even like us. In the foreign aid account, we spent $273 million last year teaching people how to apply for more of our money. So it's not bad enough that they take your money and send it to foreign countries that don't even like us. We teach these people how to apply for more of our money. We had a televised cricket league we spent over $1 million on in Afghanistan. Televised cricket league. Only problem, they don't really have any televisions. And why it's our obligation, why is the U.S. taxpayer asked to pay for a cricket league in Afghanistan? We spent $45 million on a natural gas station in Afghanistan. $45 million. It was estimated to cost $500,000, 86 times cost overruns. What does it serve up? Gasoline? Natural gas. Who has a car that runs on natural gas in Afghanistan? Nobody. So we bought them cars. We bought them cars that run on natural gas. Then they had no money to buy the natural gas, so we gave them credit cards to buy the natural gas. That's where your money's going. If you want to help the people in Texas or those people who may be hurt in Florida, why don't we quit sending the money overseas? These are the people who chant death to America, and we send more money to them. We're spending money on home mortgages in Nigeria. We spent money on tourism in Albania. This is one of my favorites. We spent money teaching people in Kenya how to use Facebook. All I'm asking is, why don't we stand up like men and women, like real legislators, and if we're going to have compassion for those in Texas, why don't we have the good wisdom not to just simply add it to our debt? In hysteria, everyone's hysterical. We must give someone else's money. But not only that, we must give money we don't have. We're going to destroy our country. There have been people who argue that our $20 trillion debt is the number one threat to our national security. Why don't we simply take some money that we were going to spend somewhere else for something not as valuable in another country, and why don't we spend it here? Because you realize what's going to happen. I will proffer this amendment, and in all likelihood, the swamp, the establishment will vote this down because they never want to cut a dime of spending. They're always compassionate. They have big hearts. They're willing to give away everybody else's money, but they're never, ever willing to pay for it. This is both parties, both Republican Party and Democrat Party. We this year are going to run a $500 billion debt. There is no money. They're giving away your grandchildren's money to help people. And people will say, that's compassion. We're going to help people now. but we're stealing it from our kids' future. Simply say, you know what? This year we can't be so compassionate to people who are wanting to get health care in Cambodia. We have USAID money going to Cambodia to help them get cost-effective or lower-cost insurance. We couldn't even do anything with the health care in our country, and we're sending money to Cambodia to help them with their health care? Why don't we act here at home? Why don't we take care of our own problems before we think we can take care of everybody else's problems everywhere around the world? Maybe that aid ought to be better spent at home. Maybe we ought to start rebuilding our country instead of always thinking we have to rebuild everybody else's country. And I think if we were to take this to a huge vote of the entire American public, I think 75 to 80% of the American public would say, you know what? Let's take care of our problems at home. Let's don't send our money abroad. And I think we'd win this battle. But watch this vote, because in Washington, you'll see the opposite. You'll see 3/4 of this body or more say, oh, no, we're not going to cut any spending to anyone. We could never cut foreign aid or welfare for foreign countries. We're just going to add it onto the tab. And remember, the next time a politician tells you that they are so compassionate because they want to give away more of someone else's money, you ask them how much they gave of their own money if you want to judge their true compassion.
The single largest contributor to the United Nations, we do this in part in order to advance our values and our interests. But we'll be honest with you. When we make generous contributions to the UN, we also have a legitimate expectation that our goodwill is recognized and respected. When a nation is singled out for attack in this organization, that nation is disrespected. What's more, that nation is asked to pay for the privilege of being disrespected. In the case of the United States, we are asked to pay more than anyone else for that dubious privilege. The United States government is answerable to its people. As such, we have an obligation to acknowledge when our political and financial capital is being poorly spent. And if our investment fails, we have an obligation to spend our resources in more productive ways. The United States will remember this day in which it was singled out for attack in the General Assembly for the very act of exercising our right as a sovereign nation. We will remember it when we are called upon to once again make the world's largest contribution to the United Nations. And we will remember it when so many countries come calling on us, as they so often do, to pay even more and to use our influence for their benefit. This vote will make a difference on how Americans look at the UN and on how we look at countries who disrespect us, and this vote will be remembered.
President Trump goes to the UN and smacks Rocket Man. So now I have Rocket Man stuck in my head, as does everyone in the United States, because President Trump decided to drop that reference during his UN speech today. We will play it for you. President Trump went to the UN and he gave what I thought was the best speech of his relatively young presidency. I thought it was quite a good speech. We'll go through what was in it and what it shows about American foreign policy, because it does sort of lend credence to the idea that all this talk about realism versus neocons, that a lot of these gaps are a little bit exaggerated, but I'll explain what I mean by all of that. Okay, so President Trump was at the UN this morning, and he gave what was, by virtually all accounts, a very good speech. A lot of people on the left are very upset because he was too mean to Iran and North Korea. He was too militant. How dare he be mean to these countries? Dianne Feinstein sent out the senator from California. She sent out a note saying that it was just terrible. How could President Trump do such a thing? She complained that he greatly escalated the danger we face from both Iran and North Korea. She said, the goals of the United Nations are to foster peace and promote global cooperation. Today, the president used it as a stage to threaten war. He missed an opportunity to present any positive action the UN could take with respect to North Korea, and he launched a diatribe against Iran, again offering no pathway forward. Okay, a couple of things about this. Number one, the Trump administration was responsible for a unanimous resolution in the UN Security Council levying more sanctions on North Korea. So Trump has done more with the UN on North Korea than Obama ever did. And with regard to Iran, it is the Iran deal that has allowed the Iranians to gain power in the region. It's the Iran deal where President Obama sent literally pallets of cash, like tens of millions of dollars, pallets of cash, to the Iranian regime, which were then funneled towards terrorism, and gave them a pathway, a legal pathway to a nuclear weapon in 10 years or less. Okay, and Dianne Feinstein is ripping Trump over all of this. Which is by suggesting he would revisit and possibly cancel the Iran nuclear agreement, he greatly escalated the danger we face from both Iran and North Korea. No, actually, it's the Iran nuclear agreement that essentially has made it clear to North Korea that they should continue to pursue a nuclear weapon, because once you get close enough to a nuclear weapon, then no one will attack you ever again. Right? What nation would negotiate with the United States when the agreements we reach with other countries are so easily undermined? We reached a negotiation with the North Koreans during the Clinton administration. Dianne Feinstein should know she was still Senator of California at the time, and it didn't make any difference. They developed a nuclear weapon anyway. So the Democrats are fighting mad, and they've been forced into the awkward position of now having to defend some of the worst people on planet Earth. So President Trump at the UN today gave what was a very interventionist speech. I mean, people are portraying this as a realist speech, but this is not really a realist speech, okay? What he was talking about today, he said things like, we don't want to intervene and change other people's systems for them. That's not our goal. But then he talked about Venezuela, and he suggested properly that they need to return to some sort of democratic rule in Venezuela. Well, if you're a hardcore realist, like a Rand Paul realist and a non-interventionist, you'd say, what does Venezuela have to do with us? Okay, so they're oppressing their own people. Okay, so their people are starving en masse. What does that have to do with us? The reality is the vast majority of Americans, as realist as we consider ourselves, still have a moral spine to what we believe about foreign policy. And that doesn't mean we can afford to be the world's policeman or that we should intervene everywhere. It does mean that when we see egregious abuses like in Venezuela, that the U.S. does consider action because the American people generally demand such action. We generally do. Now, a big problem is the American people don't then have patience for such action very often, but the fact that we actually care about Venezuela demonstrates that this is not a hardcore realist America First administration. You can be America First and still pursue America's goals because one of our goals is the fomenting of democracy and liberalism, like old school classical liberalism around the world. Again, that doesn't mean military overthrow. Sometimes that means sanctions. Sometimes that means diplomacy. But the idea that Trump is a non-interventionist, I think that didn't survive this speech today. So President Trump starts off by ripping into Venezuela and talking about socialism in Venezuela is pretty spectacular. It's clip 14.
The problem in Venezuela is not that socialism has been poorly implemented, but that socialism has been faithfully implemented.
Okay. And you hear total silence in the room. And finally, there's a little bit of applause. I like Trump just staring out at them, all the socialist countries who have been imbibing this nonsense for a while. And what he says here is exactly right. This is what I've said for a long time. It's not about socialism being a great idea misapplied. It's about a bad idea being applied properly. Every place that socialism is tried to its full capacity, it leads to massive amounts of human suffering, death, and starvation. So good for Trump on this. Trump also suggested that the world has a moral responsibility to side against aggressors. Here's President Trump talking about Iran and saying that we have to confront evil or evil will triumph.
If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. When decent people and nations become bystanders to history, the forces of destruction only gather power and strength. No one has shown more contempt for other nations and for the well-being of their own people than the depraved regime in North Korea.
Good for him. Okay, well, what he's talking about here is exactly correct. This is a far cry from President Obama, who went in front of the United Nations virtually every year and then whined about how the United States was responsible for all the world's ills. He would go up there and he would talk about how America in the past had been too braggadocious. How we, in the past, we've been too interventionist. It's been our fault. We've made people angry. We've been too arrogant. None of that from President Trump. Good for President Trump. I mean, all this is good. The fact is that we're going to need to see some actual hard policy backing the words. You know, how far is he willing to go? What is he willing to do? That's always the question, right? It's always the Sean Connery question from The Untouchables. What are you willing to do? That's always the big question in foreign policy. And we don't really have a clear answer from President Trump on that. But I know one thing he's not willing to do, and that is apologize for the U.S.'s presence on the world stage. And that's a very good thing. That's and it's reassuring because the truth is that in the past, President Trump has made sort of Ron Paulian comments about the role of the United States in the world. You remember just a few months ago, he was talking about how the U.S. has killed people like Vladimir Putin. And one of the criticisms that I think is actually not unfair of this speech is that Trump nowhere in the speech mentioned Russia, and Russia's aggression continues. And I think that's perfectly appropriate to point out that President Trump should have mentioned Russia. And that's one critique. The other critique of his speech is this line that he dropped halfway through that is totally Trumpian, where he's talking about North Korea and he just decides to drop an Elton John song in the middle of his speech about North Korea. Here's what he had to say.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
Rocket Man is on a suicide mission. He's just reading straight from his Twitter feed now. I think it's going to be a long, long time till touchdown brings me round again, man. Apparently, the North Korean delegation walked out. Apparently, they were not here for this. They said they let a junior diplomat sit in. They packed their bags last night, pre-flight, 0 hour, 9 a.m. So that's, yeah, again, I don't understand what the purpose of the Rocket Man thing is. Like, it's funny, but it also undercuts the seriousness of the situation. I mean, imagine, I saw there's a great tweet today about this. I do love that there's somebody who tweeted out about, Ronald Reagan suggesting that Ronald Reagan should have gone to Brandenburg Gate and said, well, birthmark head, tear down this wall. Might not have had quite the same impact if he had said that to Mikhail Gorbachev. So I'm not sure what the purpose is of this. It is funny. It is funny. The media are jumping on it, and they are suggesting that this demonstrates that he's not serious, suggesting that he is obviously stupid, and that's why he did all of this. He's Trump, and that's why he did all of this. But, how serious he is about North Korea, well, we're going to find out. We're going to find out, because I don't think North Korea is going to stop this sort of activity. I really don't. It is amazing to watch, however, the media go completely nuts over this speech as though he said something wildly different. Now, here's the thing that's funny. The left is going crazy over this speech because they're suggesting that President Obama never would have been so confrontational. He never would have done anything like this. President Obama launched a virtually useless and counterproductive war in Libya. President Obama signed off on the Iran deal. President Obama did nothing about North Korea. And he used to go there and talk consistently about human rights. President Trump doesn't like talking about human rights very much. But when he goes to the UN, what he is saying is more conducive to human rights than what President Obama said. A niceness on the world stage does not equal the promulgation of human rights. It doesn't equal the spread of human rights. American strength on the world stage equals the spread of human rights around the world. It doesn't mean we're always right. Doesn't mean everything we do is good. Doesn't mean every choice we make is the right one. But it does mean that a stronger America is a freer world, and a weaker America is a less free world. And even President Trump, who sort of began this campaign as an anti-interventionist, the Iraq War was evil and conspiratorial, all of this, he's moved beyond that now, as all presidents do, okay? There's a general foreign policy consensus, no matter how much we wish to buck it. Obama was the first one really to try to buck it. That says that America needs to be strong on the world stage because otherwise the world becomes a worse place. I think Trump understands that, and good for him. Well, we will be back here tomorrow. I want to give you a further breakdown of President Trump's UN speech, plus, as always, the news of the day. I'm Ben Shapiro. This is The Ben Shapiro Show.